Hey there, it is Saturday, so it's movie night, and I'm here with another quarantine quadruple feature for your viewing pleasure. Now, we just finished our 19th week of quarantine, and I just want to take a quick moment to remind you that Black Lives Matter protests are going on around the country, and even though your social media timelines have probably gone back to looking like they normally do, we still need to be doing our part to fight for this very worthy cause. So if you can't get out in the streets and protest, you're worried about COVID, you have underlying health conditions, or you're worried about getting snatched up and thrown into unmarked vans, totally understandable, but there's still more you can do. You can sign petitions, and most importantly, you can be sending your money to organizations that can benefit. What I've been doing lately is I've been looking for artists and companies that I typically support and finding ones that are making products and donating 100% of the proceeds to Black Lives Matter organizations. So, for example, Fright Rags, horror t-shirt company that I usually buy shirts from, they teamed up with Shudder for this very simple design shirt, and they donated 100% of the proceeds to BLM organizations. They raised over $67,000 off this shirt alone. So even though it doesn't seem like you're going to be making a major contribution to something, even a little bit, or buying products where the proceeds are going to go to places that could really use them, are going to make a really big difference. So, in simpler times, there are filmmakers that like to ask big existential questions, right? Why are we here? Is God real? What's the meaning of life? All the good shit like that. Now, unfortunately, lately, we haven't really had a lot of time to ponder the big questions like that. Now, our big questions that we're discussing all the time are like, why don't people believe in science anymore? Or how has a mask to protect other people become a matter of political debate? But right now, I want to go back to the bigger, more existential questions. Right now, I'm struggling with everything, just like everyone else is, and I'm feeling a little low, and I like my cinema to meet me where I'm at. So when I'm feeling sad and questioning everything in life, I don't want to watch, happy musicals. I want to watch cinema that's right where I'm at to kind of help me get through it. We're diving into 4 films from the master filmmaker Ingmar Bergman. All 4 of these films we're going to watch are very intricately linked, and I will discuss in detail why these movies work so well together. The Seventh Seal was Bergman's kind of explosion onto the American film scene. He had made, I think, 16 movies before The Seventh Seal, so he was an established filmmaker in Sweden, but that was the first movie to really blow up in America. And the reason was because in 1957, in the late 50s, we had a bunch of kind of fantasy factory type films from the 30s, the 40s, the 50s. Hollywood was pumping out very sterile, safe, beautiful movies that were just perfect escapism, and people were starting to get sick of it, and they wanted something different. They wanted something a little edgier. They wanted something more thought-provoking. And that's when The Seventh Seal hit American shores, and the movie became very popular in art house cinemas and colleges across the nation, particularly with film students and people that were just looking for something a little different than the typical shit Hollywood was shoveling out at the time. The Seventh Seal is the movie that sort of made Ingmar Bergman a household name, even if not a household name, a very famous filmmaker in America. A lot of filmmakers that were working at the time started kind of emulating his work. And The Seventh Seal has the very iconic image of Death sitting on the beach with the knight playing chess. It's been parodied countless times. Even Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey has William Sadler playing Death. That's tribute to the version of Death Bergman had in The Seventh Seal, and they just dropped the trailer for Bill and Ted Face the Music, and Death is back in that. And I'm sure most of the people that are watching the trailer excited for the new Bill and Ted movie aren't even aware of the sort of like Swedish foreign film art house roots that are laid out in the fucking Bill and Ted movies, which is kind of funny. So then he would go on to do a few more movies before The Virgin Spring. We are going to start with Bergman's masterpiece, The Virgin Spring. It was released in 1960, and this was his first film to ever win Best Foreign Film at the Academy Awards. So it was a really big deal for Sweden. The Virgin Spring takes place in the Middle Ages. It is about a girl that is raped and murdered by a group of vagrants that are wandering the countryside. They happen to turn up at the girl's parents' house looking for shelter in a storm, and they put them up in their barn, and the father discovers that they killed his daughter. and then he, a very pious religious man, has to start tackling really deep questions about forgiveness, revenge, murder. It asks a lot of really heavy questions, particularly about religion. So The Virgin Spring, I guess technically, I can't think of another one. This would probably be the first rape revenge film. So there's a genre particularly popular in the 1970s, rape revenge films. You still see them come out every once in a while. Last year or the year before, 2018, I think a French movie called Revenge came out that was really great. Every few years, there's still rape revenge films that are coming out. The problem is they're really difficult to get through. They're very grueling because in Act 1, without fail, there's a very difficult to watch rape scene. And particularly for some of these rape revenge films in the 70s, they're really sleazy. So they feel disgusting. They don't really feel cinematic. Sometimes they feel a little more exploitive. Something like I Spit on Your Grave. There's not a lot of redeeming factors to the film, except for the fact that you get to see someone taking revenge on these shitty guys who did something horrible. So that's a plus, I guess. But I mean, you got to wade through a whole lot of gross evil to get to that. Another film that's pretty much the same is Wes Craven's directorial debut, Last House on the Left. I love Wes Craven. This isn't my favorite of his films, but this is the one that put him on the map. And Last House on the Left is essentially a beat-for-beat remake of The Virgin Spring. So Wes Craven, he grew up in a very religious household, and he wasn't allowed to watch horror films when he was growing up. So he went to film school, and when it came time for him to make a movie, he had teamed up with some producers, and they were like, well, horror is very easy to sell. Let's make a horror movie. Wes Craven was like, okay. He'd never even seen a horror film. So he thought of the most horrific thing he could think of, which was The Virgin Spring. And he essentially remade The Virgin Spring, which is quite fascinating. Their lives actually have a couple parallels as well, because Ingmar Bergman's father was a minister as well. So Ingmar Bergman was constantly plagued with questions of morality and religion, and that's why a lot of Bergman's early work up to the mid-60s, almost everything he made, aside from his kind of more lighthearted like sex comedies, he's really grappling with the difficult questions about religion. Sven Nykvist was a tremendous cinematographer who he had worked with a few years previous on Sawdust and Tinsel. The Virgin Spring was the second time that Ingmar Bergman teamed up with cinematographer Sven Nykvist. And once they paired up, I think Sven went on to do the rest of Bergman's films. If he didn't do every single film, he did almost the rest of Bergman's filmography. He does like black and white cinematography better than almost any cinematographer ever has. He would go on to win the Academy Award for cinematography working with Bergman for Fanny and Alexander. But The Virgin Spring is a really powerful film that grapples with a lot of difficult subject matter. All four of these films are going to deal with difficult subject matter. And the next three films that we're going to be watching are actually a trilogy. His trilogy of faith, aka the Spider God trilogy. Three films, Through a Glass Darkly, Winterlight, and The Silence. I think two of them fit together amazingly, impeccably well for a trilogy. The Silence, the third film in the trilogy, I don't think fits the trilogy very well. What I think it should be is a trilogy of The Virgin Spring, Through a Glass Darkly, and Winterlight. And I actually don't think The Silence should be part of the trilogy, but it is. As you can see, the Criterion Collection released it as part of the trilogy. Everyone views it as his trilogy of faith, but I'm going to kind of get into why I actually think The Virgin Spring is a much better match. But we're going to watch all four of them together because I do think The Silence is still like a pretty solid way to end this series of four films. So in my eyes, The Virgin Spring is actually the beginning of Ingmar Bergman's Quadrilogy of faith. And this was a little theory that I had, and through reading Ingmar Bergman's memoir, listening to all of the commentaries and interviews that I could about these films, I have discovered I don't think I'm off base on this theory, because Ingmar Bergman, he liked to pretend that he wasn't affected by what people thought about his movies, but he absolutely was. And The Virgin Spring, even though it won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Film, it was not critically loved the way some of his other films had been. And I found out that Bergman had originally intended The Virgin Spring to be the first film in a trilogy. After the film was not received as well as he anticipated, he scrapped that idea. The next time he started working on one of those films, Through a Glass Darkly, he said that was the first film in a trilogy. So I actually think he originally intended The Virgin Spring to be the start of a trilogy, and thematically The Virgin Spring works really well in that trilogy. The second film, Through a Glass Darkly, really tackles the heavy-hitting religious questions as well. Through a Glass Darkly, the title comes from a passage in the New Testament from Corinthians. It has sort of a dual meaning because mirrors back then weren't mirrors. They were kind of just like a polished piece of metal, and so when you were looking at yourself, it was like you were looking at it through a glass darkly. So I think it's kind of examining when you can't quite get a very clear image of what you look like to yourself. So Through a Glass Darkly is about a woman who comes home from a mental institution. She's schizophrenic, and she comes home to her husband, her little brother, and her father. They live on the island of Faroe, and I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, but the island of Faroe was recommended to Bergman. He was looking for kind of a new type of location to film on, and this was like an island with very choppy waters and a lot of like sharp rocks, and he thought it was really beautiful, and he loved the island. In fact, he shot a number of his films there after Through a Glass Darkly, and then a few years later actually moved to Faroe and lived there for the rest of his life. It stars Harriet Andersson. Now, Harriet Andersson, tremendous actress. She had actually worked with Ingmar Bergman a small handful of times. They had an affair, and they made some movies together, and then she went off and she married some farmer and was living on a farm and wasn't acting anymore. Ingmar Bergman writes the script about this woman who's having more or less a mental breakdown, and he tracked down Harriet Andersson. He sent the script to her, and she's like, hey, I love the script, but like, I can't do that. I can't give the performance you want. And his response, I'm paraphrasing, but it was almost exactly like, oh, that's a bunch of bullshit. You're going to do this movie. She came and she turned out an astonishing performance. All of them are really good in this movie. Including Max von Sydow, who plays her husband. Max von Sydow is also the father in The Virgin Spring. You know him as the devil in Needful Things, the exorcist in The Exorcist, and probably most notable for portraying the knight in Bergman's own The Seventh Seal. And they're all trying to kind of deal with her and kind of pretend like everything's normal and trying to get their lives back on track. But she's kind of in the midst of another breakdown, and she claims to be hearing voices. Her father's a very famous writer, so he's not estranged from the family, but he goes on book tours a lot, and he kind of leaves the family alone, and so he sort of feels like he's not there for his family, so he's kind of ridden with guilt for that. And she finds a draft of a novel he's writing actually about her and her sickness. So she finds out that even her father is exploiting her illness for his own career, which kind of sends her spiraling down. Again, Harriet Andersson gives just a phenomenal performance. She has some breakdowns in the movie that are harrowing to watch, including when she thinks that God is coming out from behind the wallpaper, and she thinks God is a giant spider. Hence the Spider God trilogy. That's the spider. The Spider God is also referenced in his next film, Winterlight. So Through a Glass Darkly actually won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Film the year after The Virgin Spring. So Ingmar Bergman double-bagged Best Foreign Film at the Oscars after Through a Glass Darkly. Is another masterpiece. Winterlight. Now, Gunnar Bjornstrand is this guy. He plays a priest, reverend, a minister, some person of faith. I forget the actual term. I know they're all a little different. He's a pastor, Gunnar Bjornstrand. He also plays the writer father in Through Glass Darkly. He is a priest that is questioning his faith. He is confronted by one of his parishioners, played by Max von Sydow again, and he is depressed and he's struggling because China has started building nuclear weapons, and he's afraid that the whole world is just going to get nuked and he's going to die. So what's the point of living? And the pastor doesn't really have the right answers for him. And the film takes place in about a 3-hour period from like noon to 3. The parishioner that he was not able to give any adequate answers to kills himself. And that sends Gunnar Bjornstrand spiraling into questioning his religion, questioning the meaning of everything. As bleak as Through a Glass Darkly is, the message ultimately is that God is love, And if there's love in your life, then there's God in your life. That's sort of just tacked on to the end of the film. When Bergman was making this film, he clearly was not quite satisfied with his ending for Through a Glass Darkly, at least the themes that he was tackling toward the end. It gets a lot bleaker in Winter Light, and it's a thoroughly depressing film, but it is brilliant. Sven Nykvist did the cinematography for all of these films, and for Winter Light, it's very stark, simple photography. There's not a lot of camera moves. It's not pretty filmmaking necessarily, but it's a little grittier than the other two films as far as how it's made. It's so funny. Today, you watch movies, and really the big thing that a lot of filmmakers are trying to tackle is how are you going to show phones on screen? There's so much communicating in modern film and television via text message. How are you going to show that on screen? Are you just going to show a phone? Someone texting, which is like the least cinematic thing you can do. You're gonna have little thought bubbles. Everyone's taking a slightly different approach for how they're gonna show text. The first time I saw Winter Light, there's a scene where he opens up a letter and reads a letter from his girlfriend, and it's literally just a shot of her on a blank white background reading the letter straight to the lens. And I was so taken by that when I first saw that film in college, I guess. I thought it was such a simple approach to a letter, but it's not a cheesy voiceover. It's not him reading the note out loud in an unrealistic way. It was just her reading the letter to us. And it was so effective. And I haven't figured out why filmmakers haven't just started showing messages being read that way more frequently, because it's really effective and we see them reading it. And the take is like 6 minutes. She reads this really long, beautiful letter. It's memorized. She gives this really wonderful performance straight to the camera, and it's far more affecting than showing that letter in any other style. But Winter Light, it's a really brilliantly made film. Again, it tackles heavy existential questions about the existence of God, about what we're doing here, what we're choosing to devote our lives to, and the outcomes that you can kind of interpret from the film aren't necessarily as positive as Through a Glass Darkly. But again, all of these films are going to be up for interpretation. They're thought-provoking films. They're meant for you to ask questions and really debate and really question things about your own belief systems and yourself. You're really supposed to just question yourself when you watch these films. If you have seen First Reformed, Paul Schrader's brilliant film from a couple years ago starring Ethan Hawke in the best performance of his life, very heavily influenced by Bergman's masterpiece, Winter Light. Okay, for the fourth film that we're going to be diving into, The Silence. Now, The Silence, I think, doesn't really fit in the trilogy as well as The Virgin Spring for a couple reasons. One, it has nothing to do with religion. It's tackling questions that are just completely different than any questions involving religion, our existence, our belief in God, all of the good stuff that the first three films are really diving into. This movie doesn't at all. And the initial argument was it's about the absence of God and people who are living their lives without that at all, and we are supposed to feel that absence. I don't know if I wholly believe that. All of the films have very limited casts. In this instance, the main cast is 3 people. The others are like 4, 5, 6 people are the main cast. Before he made these movies, a lot of his films were sort of ensembles. Smiles of a Summer Night had a really big cast. The Seventh Seal had a fair number of people. So a lot of the bigger movies that he was getting recognition for, they were sort of ensemble casts. These were much smaller, almost like a play, which is not out of the ordinary because Bergman spent half of his life in theater. He would direct a movie in the summer, and then the rest of the year he'd be working in the theater. And all of the actors that he worked with so frequently, he like kind of pulled from his theater company. But the other reason that I think Winter Light, Through a Glass Darkly, and The Virgin Spring work so well is a trilogy. Not only is the fact that all of them directly ask big questions about religion and faith, all of them star Max von Sydow as well, who's a linchpin in a lot of Ingmar Bergman's films. He is not in The Silence, which makes it stick out a little more to me. The filmmaking is a little different in The Silence as well. For Sven Nykvist and Bergman, for his first 3 films in this quadrilogy, they don't have a crazy amount of camera movement or anything like that. There's a lot of static shots. The Silence moves the camera a lot more. It's not insane. It's not an insane amount of movement, but the filmmaking is a little different. It's sort of uneasy with the camera moves they've incorporated. And it's about 3 people, 2 sisters, and one of them has a son and they're kind of traveling through this fictional country. It's in the middle of a war, and they don't speak the language, and they're having kind of a communication barrier with everyone they encounter, and they stay in this big, mysterious hotel that seems almost empty. It's very reminiscent of something like The Shining, and it even has a kid kind of wandering the hotel, and you see most of the movie through his eyes, which is very rare for Bergman to incorporate a child into one of his movies. The two sisters represent the two sides of one woman. One of them is more intellectual, and she's a little more reserved. She smokes a lot, she masturbates a lot, but she doesn't have human connections with other people. The other sister is more of like a sexual being. She goes out into the world and she meets people, and she watches like two people having sex in a theater, kind of in a seat near her. She like doesn't look away, and she like hooks up with another guy. And the reason The Silence was pretty groundbreaking for its time was it's pretty explicitly sexual. And what's funny is that when they made the movie, Winter Light and Through a Glass Darkly and Virgin Spring had all been, you know, successful for like a Swedish film. Two of them won Best Foreign Film, but they didn't necessarily make tons and tons of money. So when they were making The Silence, the last installment, they weren't expecting it to really break any records. They weren't expecting lines around the block or anything like that. However, once you start advertising a movie as risque and sexual and having really beautiful women in explicit sex scenes, especially for 1963, people were lined up around the block to watch The Silence. It was the most financially successful about all of them, because people are depraved perverts, and when they hear they're going to see some titties on screen, then they line up to go see some sex scenes with beautiful actresses. By today's standards, it's pretty tame, but it's still pretty sexy, and it's still like a very disturbing, strange, depressing film. I've actually never watched all four of these movies in one sitting. I have watched the Trilogy of Faith in one sitting during the Ingmar Bergman retrospective in 2018. And unfortunately, I was expecting it to be like a sold out show, thinking everyone would be like craving some like really good fucking cinema. And the theater was like maybe half full for the first movie and maybe like a third full by the third movie. So that was pretty unfortunate, but they're some of my favorite Bergman films, and he's one of my top 3 favorite filmmakers of all time. I know, black and white existential films that are sort of depressing, you're gonna have to read. They're gonna challenge the way you think. That's probably not what you want for a Saturday night of movie watching. But I love exposing people to the cinema of Ingmar Bergman because he always touches something in people's souls. He's such a good filmmaker, and he will resonate with you on some level. If you give him a chance and kind of start challenging yourself with some of the cinema that you're willing to accept into your life and actually watch the movie and watch the shot compositions and the performances, and don't pick up your phone, and really just immerse yourself in cinema from another country, from another decade, I swear to you, it is rewarding. It is something that will pay off in dividends if you continue exposing yourself to different cinema regularly. It will eventually nourish your soul. You will start to realize what you've been missing by only consuming American cinema your entire life. 4 films by the master Swedish filmmaker Ingmar Bergman: The Virgin Spring, Through a Glass Darkly, Winter Light, and The Silence. We are going to watch Ingmar Bergman's Quadrilogy of Faith. I hope you enjoy the movies. If you watch them, I really hope you give them a chance. Thanks for watching. Hope everyone's staying healthy, and I'll see you next week. Thanks.